Renna's Crossing by Geordie Morse. This is an audio version as read by the author. Chapter 16 Rainy Day Drumbeat Blues. 3 days later, the storm had broken, but not metaphorically. From underneath the narrow eaves of the rectory's outside wall, Renna watched the rain spill off the roof and fall in front of her in chaotic, pulsating surges, splattering the mud like a raucous drumline, accompanying the otherwise rhythmic and moody strumming heard in the garden beyond. At least the flowers were enjoying the show, throwing back their heads and trying to drink it all up in the eternal moment before the music stopped. Renna was also trying to get lost in the sounds of the rain, before Job found her again and had her return to the depths of the rectory, where the weather couldn't even be heard, no matter how tumultuous. On days like this, they had to use flashlights or candles to navigate through the hallways, which were gloomy enough as it was. Renna wasn't sure that what had gotten into Job since they had arrived. She had assumed that once the threat of the demon was lifted, they might be more relaxed and a bit easier to learn from. On the contrary, it seemed like they had sat down hard upon whatever stick they had up their ass, lodging it so far up Renna reckoned she could see it when they opened their mouth to criticize whatever she happened to be doing at that moment. The Book of Abremelin had remained in her bag. Sometimes it stayed there because she was too tuckered out from Job's study routine to think about anything magical besides a good afternoon nap. Other times it was because the rectory was a poor aesthetic substitute for the cozy bookshelves of Ebon Terrell. No matter the excuse, the mood that had kept her turning the pages every day back in Grotney wasn't with her at the moment. The card she had accepted from Noida remained stashed in her bag as well. It didn't really matter anyway. From what Renna had seen, there might not even be a landline phone connected to the rectory, which made her wonder how Job contacted Father Chen in the first place. Maybe the wards did their part in boosting the cell service in this backwater part of the endless Adirondack wilderness. The door nearby opened, and Renna's surprised reaction nearly made her shoulder receive a wet drumbeat of rain from the eaves. She let her breath go when she saw it was Father Chen and not Job, who seemed just as surprised to see her. "I thought you were supposed to be in training with Job." "I thought you were supposed to be in a meeting this afternoon." Renna's eyes locked on the trimmers and gloves in the father's hand. He held them up guiltily with a conspiratorial smile. "You wouldn't believe how much time adults can set aside to talk about very little. I've been hoping the rain would have let up by now, but it seems the heavens wish to continue granting us their bounty." He closed the door and sidled under the eaves, joining Renna in her sequester. The two of them started their conversation with silence, their gazes sharing the raindrops as they fell. Finally, Renna asked one of the questions she had on her long list. "You knew my grandmother, right?" Job said something of the sort. Chen nodded. "I did indeed. An extraordinary woman, though I'm sure that's old praise for you to hear by now." Renna shrugged. "If enough people say it, it's got to be true. I don't really remember her at all. I don't know if I even met her even." "You did." These words got Renna looking at Father Chen attentively. "For the short time you both existed together in this world, Mab had fond memories of you. She never failed to tell them more than once to her close friends, though that may be because they were tragically few." "Why's that? If she liked me, why didn't she come visit me more?" "From what she told me, your mother, her daughter-in-law, was not fond of the idea of witchcraft. Mab became the dark horse of the family once her son married your mother." There were two more characters in the story, people unfamiliar to Renna, but who she would technically call Mom and Dad. She didn't like to admit it, but she could barely remember them at all. Soft flashes once in a while crawled across her dreaming mind, but they were like ancient photographs. Anytime she tried to touch them, she would just damage them and they would fade away even more. To protect them, she had to keep them locked away in the dark. "Believe it or not," Father Chen continued on, unaware of Renna's internal angst, "I met Mab back in the days of peace, love, and rock and roll. Can you imagine me as a hippie? Absolutely not, Renna replied truthfully. Neither could my parents, which is the main reason why I did it, Father Chen laughed. Plenty of ways for the only son of first-generation Chinese immigrants to dishonor his family. I chose the path that led me across the country in vans full of sweat, song, and various other features of the time. He curtailed his musings as he remembered who he was talking to. I met Mab after falling in with a particularly witchy group of wanderers who were all about worshipping the moon goddess. They had plenty of elaborate rituals they wanted to try way out in the backwoods, like these, where they wouldn't need to disturb anyone else's peace. We joined up with several other groups who shared our interests, and she was among them. It was hard to tell if she just tagged along with her people, or they venerated her so much that they gave her more space than they did each other. But anyone could tell she was different. Renna wasn't quite sure of what to make of the story Father Chen was telling her right now. While she couldn't doubt him, his anecdote had an obscure quality about it, like a movie you watch on TV at a strange hour of the night, where you might recognize the actors, but not the characters or the story they're in. To turn a novel into a novella, another witch there was planning to hijack the ritual for some foul magic. Mab stepped in and made things right before anyone was seriously harmed. I was the only one who ended up with mundane injuries, which she treated. I was far more affected by what I had witnessed. She helped with that too, and filled in the gaps that allowed me to see a whole new side of the world. We traveled together on and off after that, and the bonds of a long and wonderful friendship formed, which kept us writing letters even after our paths went in very different directions, mine leading me to become a man of the cloth. It sounds nice to be able to keep in touch with people like that for so long. Renna, there will never be a day when life cannot surprise you with its providence. I knew Mab for many years, and then her student Job came to me after her untimely death. And now I speak with you, the student of her student and blood of her blood. I say this with many more decades than you've yet lived, but these kinds of connections are what keep people moving forward. I guess so. I keep hearing people say that I'm like Mab, even though I don't have any memories of her. You would think if Job spent so much time learning from her that they would be, I don't know, a little more the way that Mab and I are. Father Chen laughed at this. You put yourself on Mab's side. Interesting. What do you mean? Certainly there's much to be said for family heritage. But at your current stage in life, you remind me far more of Job. What? Renna didn't mean to sound so incredulous, but the father had genuinely taken her by surprise, and it made him chuckle even more. The first time I met her, Mab was older than either you or Job. While she undeniably had her willful and stubborn moments, she also had a large measure of patience, and her impressive love for others, even mere strangers, allowed her to make connections where others would make enemies. Of course, in the times when that good nature of hers was finally exhausted, you did not want to be the one falling short in her eyes. Chen could see that Renna had not yet crested the logical rise that he was already standing upon, so he continued with his explanation. You and Job, back when they were your age, both lack the hard-won wisdom that came earlier to Mab due to circumstance. You're struggling, similarly to how Job struggled when they came to live here under our care. I am grateful to you, at least, for not causing nearly as much property damage. Renna raised an eyebrow. You're saying Job did? She vaguely remembered Job mentioning something about their past back in Leaderville that might have suggested they were wilder than they were now. Oh, yes. In their long-lasting battle to take hold of their tumultuous emotions, very little inside the rectory was safe from their sporadic fits. Most of the windows you've seen in the building are replacements from the last 10 years or so. Even managed to remove a couple of the doors from their hinges, impressively enough. Nice little collections of holes in the wall, too. Actually, if you stick your head around the eaves for a moment, can you see that smaller window right at ground level? It's the window for one of the basement storerooms. That was the one Job would always break out through when they wanted to get away from the rectory for a little while. Not sure why, it certainly wasn't the most convenient. It was true. The small double-pane window that was hidden amongst the tall blades of grass barely looked large enough for an irate teenager to squeeze through. Renna turned back to the father, shaking the rain that had caught in her hair when she stuck her head out. That's crazy. That doesn't sound a thing like the Job I know now. Father Chen shook his head and chuckled. No, it does not, and thank the Lord for it. It pleases me to no end to see how much they've calmed down and gotten their head on straight, although they've still got plenty of growing up to do. Renna knew she could be moody and rebellious at various times, but this sounded like straight-up juvenile delinquency. She wondered if the father thought it would be only a matter of time before she began breaking windows as well. Father Chen proved once again to have a good sense of how to steer the conversation. I don't mean to liken to you two in bad habits. Excuse me if it came off that way. What I meant was, both of you have a fire burning inside. It's in your body, your mind, and you're not sure whether or not you're in control of it yet. Job fed theirs with strong emotions of sorrow, guilt, and rage at the time. It hurt very much, but it pushed them forward to a better place. You seem to have intense curiosity and will that drives you, generally more positive forces. Two birds of different feathers, but still flocking together if I might be witty. The magpie and the goldfinch. Sorry, the magpie and the goldfinch? Renna hurried to keep up with Father Chen's musings. Are you saying me and Job are somehow like those birds? Father Chen nodded. I would say so. You would be the magpie, of course. That's what Mab always called you in her letters. She said that your spiritual connection to such birds was evident at birth. She was always quick to see omens and portents around her, and you would have to trust in her until she was proven right. But maybe that was just her deeper inner connection to the magical world that others like me longed for. This news wasn't hard for Renna to believe. She thought back to the times when her hexing emerged. Birds were a common theme. Even the time in Grotny, wherein she supposedly did it under her own power, it was the birds that came to help her. Although, judging by the amount of scratches she and her friends received, the help might have been incidental to the general chaos. So, why a magpie then? What's special about that bird? I'm afraid I can't tell you nearly as much as Mab could have. But magpies are witch birds, first and foremost. They're deeply connected to witchcraft and make good familiars for magic folks. They protect and serve those who demonstrate their craft. Renna felt a shy bit disappointed. They were witch birds and she was a witch. It sounded like a connection drawn from one of those daily horoscope pages. Besides that, Father Chen continued, magpies are well known for their nests. They build them strong and sturdy and take great care of the space they make home. They also have a penchant for decorating it with shiny objects, things they collect that catch their eye. This threw Renna's thoughts back to her room in Engelnook. It had always been called her nest by the dads and other homers, especially with her hanging glass in the windows. She suddenly felt a deeper appreciation for the bird Father Chen was comparing her to. They knew what a home should feel like, at least. Anyway, that's really about all I know. I'm not sure what you think of it. It's always a witch's personal choice, sometimes a spiritual one, to identify with an animal enough to consider it a familiar. It's far too early along your own path to be worried about that now. But hopefully I've sated your curiosity. Renna nodded. Oh, but what about Job, the goldfinch? Ah, yes. Well, that was actually my own connection. I don't know if there's a simple way to explain it. But in Christian iconography, the goldfinch is associated with the Passion of Christ. It eats thistles, as it supposedly plucked the thistles from the crown of thorns to spare Jesus in his suffering. For its effort, it was pricked by the thistle and bled, which is why goldfinches have a patch of crimson in their plumage, symbolizing their part in our Lord's mission. The bird has a deep connection with the church, where Job has, at points in their life, found sanctuary. Renna felt, at this moment, that she should know Job better than she did. What Father Chen was telling her was clearly integral to who Job was and how they came to be who they were now, but it still felt like they were talking about two different people. Renna couldn't bridge the gap in her mind of the teacher who stood before her and rarely ever showed pride or joy at the progress she had made due to her lack of superhuman discipline, and the young, reckless renegade that might have punched their older version in the face. That explanation might have been a bit obtuse if you don't come from a Christian background. However, a simpler answer is that Job shares the goldfinch's penchant for beautiful and enduring song. I know, Father Chen assured her, not even needing to see her reaction this time. They haven't done it in a long while, but I can promise you, they have always enjoyed singing the hymns in service. And, at the rare times, a little blues. I don't know where they picked that up from. But there is much more they keep hidden behind that stern, composed face. Keep pushing and you'll see it. You're the best one for the job. The father had taken the last pause to turn the end of his touching insight into a pun, which hung lower in the air than the stormy humidity. He laughed at himself to spare his ego, and then the two of them laughed together for real. In the time they had been talking, the rain had let up a bit, with a raucous drumbeat quieting down to match the steamy fizz that the flowers bathed in. Father Chen squinted out at his prized plants. The fact that we haven't been apprehended out here yet means we're probably both in a great deal of trouble by now. They're waiting for us to show our faces again. What do you say? Shall we muster our courage and go in and to face our respective music? Renna nodded silently, knowing there wasn't really another option. Besides, she felt more cooled off towards Job now, although they might not feel the same towards her. More than anything, she wanted time to talk with them, without the roles of teacher and student putting a divisive pressure on both of them. It curtailed conversation and invited argument. If they would just respect her thoughts and input a bit more, and give her a bit more space to try out her own ideas before they came in and told her it was all wrong, she felt like they could be getting along famously. She wasn't stupid, she wasn't incapable, and she wasn't trying to be obstinate. But Job's constant need for discipline gave her no time to show them otherwise. If only she could show it. She wondered. Up till now, the Book of Abramelin had stayed tucked away in her bag, but it had always given her answers when she needed them before. Would it do so again? Job was sitting at a table in the great hall when they heard Renna and Father Chen coming back inside. When Renna had not come back from her drink of water, their first instinct was to go track her down yet again, but at the same time, they weren't sure it would do much good. The more they worked together, the snarkier and more obstinate Renna became. It was confusing for them. She had wanted to get past the basics and start learning what she thought of as real witchcraft, so when Job was trying to help her do exactly that, why was she still making such a fuss? As Job had been mulling over the situation, Father Chen had found them and offered up a tag-out. It seemed that he had managed to delegate his importance out of the meeting, and thus was free to leave for a bit. Wise as ever, the father patted them on the shoulder and said that what Renna needed right now was a different source of authority. Someone to let off steam with, which would then open the doors for reconciliation and readjustment. It was a tactic they had used on Job quite often back in the day. As they watched Father Chen walk off to pick up his gardening tools, Job took a moment to acknowledge how clever the father was in dealing with all kinds of people, especially those who were being difficult. They certainly hadn't given him any quarter back in their youthful years, but Father Chen had managed to pull Job through with this unique style of care. It was like an iron rod with a soft, downy covering. It was warm and gave where it needed to, but there was always the sturdy, uncompromising core. Like Mab's teaching, it was something that Job tried to emulate, but seemed to only produce the negative results of. Job heard Father Chen approaching them across the great hall. "A good talk," he said, wiping the efforts of his labor off his palms. "She's returned to her room. I would wait a little before re-establishing the rapport. Give things some time to settle." Job nodded. "I believe it was during that time when I made those marks on the walls of my old bedroom." Father Chen pursed his lips together in remembrance. "Ah, yes. Nothing a bit of spackle couldn't fix. Of course, it didn't mean much when you just punched the same spot again. The two of them shared a laugh about it, something that could only happen years after the events had occurred. Job stood up and stretched. In that case, I think I'll take a walk. I'll take a walk about before checking in. The rain still fell silently outside, so Job had to confine their wanderings to the rectory's interior. Thinking back to the past that Father Chen had brought up, they recalled how stifling the rectory had felt and how they had always been looking for a way to escape, to be outside the boundaries of the walls and the rules for a little while. Back then, they couldn't imagine a time when they would be satisfied, perhaps even calmed, by pacing through the dim corridors and stairwells of the old building. It was frustrating. To watch Renna fighting through feelings that Job likely knew very well at one point, and to stand in front of her as an authority that likely caused much of that discontent. Time and again, they found themselves unsure of how to teach values that they knew were important, but required time and hindsight to understand. Even a troubled, reactionary kid had been able to get over their issues and learn the values of focus, clear judgment, and forethought, which had allowed them to truly come into their own practice of magic. Then they had to watch Renna struggle with the concepts they understood well, but instead of following their tutelage, she only seemed to advance when she deviated in her own fashion. Job had hoped that once they reached the rectory and Renna was integrated with a small magical community there, things would fall into place for her. But even Father Chen, who held an opinion that Job regarded highly, seemed to believe that Job was inadequate as an instructor. Despite their best efforts, they had done something wrong, and that was likely the reason for the difficulties in Renna's training. It had been foolish to even attempt the task, having let themselves be convinced by Renna's eagerness. But that was simply a larger part of her personality, Job saw now. She was eager and curious about almost everything, and perhaps witchcraft, while strong in her blood, was another hobby that she could add to her repertoire. And what had been one of her principal arguments? So that she could have some measure of defense against the hellspawn that was out there hunting her down? Job couldn't possibly make her understand the true nature of a demon. Not to a teenager, not to a newly initiated witch, not to anyone who hadn't had the misfortune of encountering one. Even a celebrated witch like Mab hadn't been able to keep the beast buried in the ground. What naive hope was Renna harboring that made her believe such power was within her reach? It didn't really matter now, though. They had made it here to the rectory, whose holy barriers, both physical and magical, were an anathema even to a demon like that. She was finally, truly safe, and now Job could allow themselves to breathe easier. They had time now, and that time would allow Renna to evolve at her own pace. Maybe that was the factor that, when absent, caused too much friction between the personalities of the teacher and student. Maybe things would be better now. Job let these positive thoughts accompany them through the empty, echoing galleries of the upper floor. Memories made their home here, unconcerned by the troubles of the present. Portraits of important people, witches and witch isn't alike, hung upon the walls or hid beneath dust sheets. Magical artifacts had been made into memento mori, presented on cushions of velvet or behind cases of glass. As a youth, Job had little knowledge of who these items once belonged to or why they were important enough to rot away up here. But now they stopped in front of one of the newest additions to the gallery. They were looking at a collection of scrolls and books, the same ones that Mab had stuffed into their backpack on the night she had made Job escape from her house. It turned out that most of them were particularly rare magical grimoires, which Mab had collected or written herself over the long years. A few of them had helped Job in their own path as a witch. At one point, there had been a debate over whether they should have been given to Eben Terrell to add to their collection, but ultimately it was Father Chen's decisive word that kept them here. Job doubted that the father had been hesitant to add more of Mab's old belongings to his own sanctuary. They passed through the gallery, finally deciding it was time to check in on Renna. She always seemed to bounce back fairly quickly after an altercation, likely a trait gained from living in close quarters to many other kids her age. But the first moment of reconciliation usually had Job stiff with anxiety. It wouldn't be until they heard Renna's usual cheerful tone of voice that the awkwardness would be dispelled and they could carry on more or less as before. Although, perhaps carrying on as before was part of the problem. Each time they had tried to bridge the gap that widened between them, it felt like their efforts were cut short of having a meaningful resolution, mostly because they still both held things back. They say that honesty was the best policy, but policy is not always a solution. Job knocked on the heavy wooden door to Renna and Sarah's room, and Renna asked who it was, in the cadence of one who was taken by surprise. Job identified themselves and was permitted to enter the room. Renna stood there, a smile on her face, but it had a different feeling than usual. She moved quickly to draw Job's attention, which for a moment had fallen on the backpack on her bed. A book was sticking out of it, having just been hastily shoved in there. The book's cover and frayed pages were unique enough for Job to recognize it from somewhere. Renna tried to tactically block the view by standing in front of it, but it was too late, and the two of them began a very different conversation from what Job had expected.